Ladies and gentlemen, change is one of the hardest things in life, whether it's leaving a job, ending a toxic relationship, or stepping away from something that no longer serves our purpose. Exiting is never easy, but there comes a time when God whispers or sometimes shouts, it's time to go. And when he does, our job is not to hesitate, but to trust and obey. So if you've been sensing that God is calling you to exit a situation, don't let fear hold you back. Trust his timing. Follow his lead. Walk in faith, knowing that he is making a way for something greater, because when God says it's time to exit, he's already prepared the place where you are meant to go. Too often, we cling to situations that God has already released us from. We hold on to past seasons, familiar places, and even unhealthy habits because they feel comfortable. But comfort does not equal calling. The Israelites wanted to stay in Egypt because slavery felt safer than uncertainty. Yet God had a promised land waiting for them. The same is true for us. When God calls us to exit, it's not to abandon us, but to lead us into something greater. Recognizing divine timing is one of the most crucial aspects of faith. It is the ability to discern when God is signaling that a certain season in life is coming to an end. Many people struggle with this because they are either too comfortable where they are or too afraid of what lies ahead. But when God says it's time to exit, he is not making a suggestion. He is giving a directive. It is important to understand that divine timing is not based on human logic or personal preference. It is not about when we feel ready or when circumstances seem ideal. Instead, it is about aligning with God's perfect plan and trusting that he knows what is best, even when we cannot see the full picture. One of the biggest challenges in recognizing divine timing is distinguishing between personal desire and God's will. People often confuse their own impatience or frustration with God's direction. They may feel restless in their job or relationships and assume that it's time to leave, but God may be calling them to stay and grow. On the other hand, some people remain in situations long past their expiration date because they are afraid to move forward. They rationalize their reluctance by telling themselves that they are waiting for a clearer sign, when in reality, God has already made it clear that it is time to go. The key is to develop spiritual sensitivity through prayer, scripture, and reflection. When we seek God's guidance consistently, he will reveal his timing in ways that may not always be obvious, but will always be certain. Throughout the Bible, we see examples of how divine timing operates. In the story of Moses, God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt at a very specific moment. Moses initially resisted, questioning his ability and doubting whether the people would follow him. But God had already determined that the time of Israel's slavery had ended, and Moses was the chosen leader to guide them to freedom. Had Moses ignored God's timing, the Israelites might have remained in bondage much longer. The lesson here is that when God says it's time to exit, obedience is required. Delaying out of fear or self-doubt only prolongs unnecessary suffering. Another powerful example is in the life of Elijah. After experiencing a great victory against the prophets of Baal, he found himself on the run from Queen Jezebel. In his despair, he hid in a cave, feeling lost and alone. But God told him that it was time to leave the cave and continue his mission. Elijah could have stayed in his place of fear, but God had already planned his next steps. When God says it's time to exit, it is often a call to move beyond fear and into faith. Many people find themselves in similar situations, trapped in a place of uncertainty, waiting for something to change, but divine timing requires action. When God calls, he expects movement. Staying in a place that God has called you to leave can hinder the blessings that are waiting ahead. Recognizing divine timing also means understanding the signs that God provides. Sometimes he closes doors to make it clear that a season is over. A job loss, a broken relationship, or a sudden shift in circumstances can all be indicators that God is directing you elsewhere. These moments can feel painful, but they are often necessary for growth. Other times, God may not shut the door completely, but will place a growing discomfort in your heart, making it clear that you can no longer stay where you are. Ignoring these signs can lead to stagnation and frustration. Instead of resisting, it is important to embrace the changes God is bringing and trust that he is leading you to something better. God's timing is not always convenient. Sometimes he calls people to exit situations when they feel least prepared. This is because divine timing is not about human readiness, but about spiritual alignment. The disciples were called to follow Jesus while they were still tending to their daily work. They did not have time to plan or make arrangements. They simply had to trust that Jesus knew what he was doing. The same applies today. When God calls someone to exit, he does not wait for them to feel comfortable. He expects them to trust him and move forward, even when they do not have all the answers. There is also a deep sense of peace that comes with recognizing divine timing. Even in the midst of uncertainty, those who trust God's direction will find that their spirit is at rest. They may not know exactly what the future holds, but they know who holds their future. This peace comes from knowing that God's plans are always for good. When he calls someone to exit, it is never to bring harm, but to lead them into greater purpose. Holding on to situations out of fear or reluctance can create anxiety and unrest. But when people surrender to God's timing, they will find that everything falls into place according to his perfect will. Recognizing divine timing is a journey of faith. It requires a willingness to let go of personal expectations and embrace God's greater plan. It is about trusting that his ways are higher than ours and that his timing is always perfect. When God says it's time to exit, he is not asking for negotiation or delay. He is calling for trust, obedience, and action. Those who recognize and follow his timing will find themselves stepping into a future that is far greater than anything they could have planned for themselves. Exiting is an act of faith. Abraham had to leave his homeland without knowing where he was going. The disciples had to drop their nets and follow Jesus, not fully understanding the journey ahead. When God tells us to move, it may not always make sense, but his plans are always better than ours. If we delay, we risk missing the blessings he has prepared for us. The courage to let go is one of the greatest tests of faith. It requires trust, strength, and the willingness to step into the unknown. Many people struggle with letting go because they associate it with loss, but in reality, it is often the beginning of something greater. Holding on to something that God has asked you to release only delays the blessings he has in store. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty can make letting go feel impossible, but when God says it is time to exit, courage must take the lead over comfort. One of the main reasons people find it difficult to let go is the emotional attachment they develop to people, places, or situations. Whether it is a long-term relationship, a job that feels secure, or a dream they have invested years into, the idea of walking away can feel overwhelming. They ask themselves, what if I never find something better? What if I regret this decision? But fear of the unknown is not a reason to stay in a situation that no longer serves God's purpose. Faith is about trusting that even when you cannot see the next step, God has already prepared the way. When he says to let go, he is not leaving you empty-handed. He is making room for something better. The Bible provides countless examples of people who had to summon the courage to let go in order to step into God's greater plan. One of the most well-known stories is that of Abraham. God told him to leave his homeland, his family, and everything familiar to go to a place that he would show him. Abraham had no map, no specific destination, and no guarantees. All he had was God's promise that he would bless him and make him into a great nation. If Abraham had held on to his comfort zone, he would have missed out on the destiny that God had planned for him. Letting go requires the ability to trust in promises that have not yet been fulfilled. It demands faith in a future that is not yet visible. Another example is the story of Peter walking on water. When Jesus called him out of the boat, Peter had to let go of the safety of what he knew and step into something completely unnatural. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to walk above the waves. But the moment he focused on the storm around him, fear took over and he began to sink. This is what happens when people struggle to let go. If they focus on the uncertainty and the risks, fear will paralyze them. But if they focus on God's power and his calling, they will find the strength to move forward. Letting go is not about having all the answers. It is about having faith in the one who does. Letting go also means releasing control. Many people hold on to situations because they believe they can fix them or make things better if they just try harder. They stay in toxic relationships hoping that the other person will change. They hold on to jobs that drain them because they are afraid of financial insecurity. They refuse to walk away from old habits and patterns because they do not know who they are without them. But true courage is found in surrendering control to God. It is understanding that his plans are higher than ours and that his ways are better. When God asks us to let go, he is not asking us to figure everything out on our own. He is asking us to trust that he already has a plan in place. Letting go is also a process of renewal. It is not just about walking away from something, but about making space for something new. When a tree sheds its leaves in the fall, it is not dying. It is preparing for new growth in the spring. In the same way, when God calls someone to exit a situation, it is not a loss, but a transition. There are seasons in life where certain relationships, jobs, or dreams served a purpose, but when that purpose is fulfilled, clinging to them only prevents further growth. People often ask God for new opportunities, but are unwilling to release the old ones. They pray for new blessings while holding on to what is familiar, but faith requires action. Letting go is not just about believing in God's plan. It is about taking the steps necessary to walk in it. The courage to let go does not mean the absence of fear. It means moving forward despite the fear. It means trusting that what is ahead is greater than what is behind. It means understanding that God does not take something away without replacing it with something better. Even when it is painful, even when it is uncertain, and even when it does not make sense, letting go is always an act of faith. The greater the surrender, the greater the blessing. Those who have the courage to release what God has asked them to will find themselves stepping into a future that is far beyond anything they could have imagined. But exiting doesn't just mean leaving something behind. It means stepping into something new. A better opportunity, a renewed sense of purpose, a closer walk with God. Every exit is an entrance to a new chapter, and every closed door is a step toward the destiny he has designed for us. Discerning when God says it is time to leave requires a deep sense of spiritual awareness. Many people struggle with recognizing the signs that it is time to move on because they are too caught up in their emotions, routines, or fears. They hold on to situations far longer than they should, hoping that something will change, when in reality, God has already given them clear signals to exit. Knowing when to leave is not just about recognizing external circumstances. It is about listening to God's voice and understanding his guidance in every situation. One of the most common ways God signals that it is time to leave is through a lack of peace. When something no longer aligns with God's plan, it often creates internal unrest. A job that once brought joy now feels burdensome. A relationship that once felt fulfilling now causes more pain than happiness. A place that once felt like home now feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. This inner conflict is not something to ignore. It is often the Holy Spirit prompting a person to pay attention. God does not create confusion. He is a God of order and peace. If someone consistently feels uneasy about a situation despite praying, seeking counsel, and doing everything they can to make it work, that may be a clear sign that it is time to move on. Another sign that God is calling someone to leave is stagnation. God's plan is always about growth, transformation, and purpose. When a person finds themselves stuck in the same place with no progress, no new opportunities, and no sense of fulfillment, it may be a sign that God is closing a chapter. People are created for movement, for purpose, and for impact. Staying in a situation that no longer allows growth can be a sign of disobedience rather than faithfulness. The Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, not because God intended them to stay there, but because they refused to trust him and move forward. When God calls someone to exit a situation, lingering too long can lead to unnecessary delays in their destiny. God also confirms when it is time to leave by removing certain things from a person's life. Opportunities begin to dry up, relationships begin to shift, and doors that were once open begin to close. When things no longer flow the way they once did, it may be God's way of redirecting a person's path. Many people fight to keep things in their lives that God is trying to take away. They try to open doors that God has shut, forcing their way into places that are no longer meant for them. But when God removes something, it is always for a reason. He is either protecting, redirecting, or preparing for something greater. Holding on to what he is trying to take away only creates unnecessary pain and delay. Discerning when to leave also requires paying attention to how circumstances are unfolding. Sometimes God allows discomfort to push a person toward their next season. In the Bible, Elijah was by a brook where God provided water for him during a drought. But when the brook dried up, it was a sign that God was calling him to move on. Many people ignore the drying up of their own brooks, choosing to stay in places where they no longer belong. Instead of seeing these moments as signs to exit, they view them as obstacles to overcome. But when God allows something to fade away, it is often his way of saying that the time and that place is over. God also speaks through people. Wise counsel from trusted spiritual leaders, mentors, or friends can confirm what God is already saying. Many times, people hear God's voice telling them to leave, but they hesitate because they need confirmation. God often uses others to reaffirm his message. When multiple people give the same advice, share similar insights, or warn about a situation, it is important to pay attention. However, it is also crucial to seek wisdom from those who are spiritually grounded. Not everyone's opinion is in alignment with God's will, so discerning the right voices is just as important as listening to them. Timing is also a key factor in discerning when to leave. Leaving too early can mean missing out on valuable lessons, while staying too long can lead to unnecessary hardship. God's timing is perfect, and when he signals that it is time to move, obedience is necessary. Delayed obedience can turn into disobedience. When Lot and his family were told to leave Sodom, they hesitated, and his wife ultimately looked back, which led to her destruction. Looking back and longing for what God has told someone to leave behind can hinder progress. Trusting God's timing means being willing to leave even when it is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or uncertain. Ultimately, knowing when God is calling someone to leave is about developing a close relationship with him. The more time a person spends in prayer and the word and in his presence, the clearer his voice becomes. God does not want his children to live in confusion or uncertainty. He provides wisdom to those who seek it and guidance to those who ask. Recognizing when it is time to leave requires faith, courage, and trust in the fact that God's plans are always better than anything that is left behind. Trusting God in transition is one of the most challenging yet necessary aspects of faith. Change is often uncomfortable, and leaving behind the familiar can create feelings of fear, doubt, and uncertainty. However, God never calls someone to move without having a plan in place. The process of transition is not just about stepping into something new, but also about deepening trust in God's guidance, provision, and purpose. Those who learn to rely on him in the midst of transition will find peace even when the next steps are unclear. One of the greatest struggles during transition is the feeling of instability. People like to know where they are going, how things will work out, and what the outcome will be. But God often operates differently. He calls people to move without revealing every detail. He did this with Abraham, telling him to leave his homeland without giving him a final destination. This is the essence of faith, trusting in God's promise without needing to see the full picture. Transition is a test of faith, requiring complete reliance on God's direction rather than human understanding. It forces individuals to surrender control and walk in obedience, even when the path is unclear. Fear of the unknown is another challenge that arises during times of transition. People often worry about whether they'll have enough resources, whether they will succeed, or whether they are making the right decision. But trusting God means believing that he will provide exactly what is needed at the right time. In the Bible, when God led the Israelites out of Egypt, he did not show them the promised land immediately. Instead, he provided manna each day, teaching them to depend on him one step at a time. This same principle applies to every transition. God does not always reveal everything at once, but he provides enough for each step forward. Those who trust him learn to rely on his daily provision rather than their own limited understanding. Another challenge of transition is the temptation to go back to what is familiar. When things get difficult, it is natural to want to return to the comfort of what was left behind. The Israelites did this when they faced hardships in the wilderness, longing to return to Egypt even though it was a place of bondage. This mindset is dangerous because it keeps people from stepping into the greater things God has prepared. Trusting God in transition means resisting the urge to retreat and instead choosing to move forward in faith. The discomfort of change is temporary, but the blessings of obedience are lasting. During times of transition, it is also easy to feel isolated. Moving into something new often means leaving behind old environments, relationships, or routines. And this can create a sense of loneliness. making it even more difficult to trust the process. But God does not abandon his people in transition. He walks with them. Jesus promised that he would never leave or forsake those who follow him. Even in moments of uncertainty, he provides comfort, reassurance, and guidance. One of the best ways to strengthen trust in transition is through consistent prayer and time spent in God's presence. The more a person connects with God, the more peace they will have in the midst of change. Trusting God in transition also requires patience. Many people expect immediate results after stepping into something new, but God's timing is not the same as human timing. Sometimes the transition period lasts longer than expected, creating frustration and doubt. Joseph experienced this when he was sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned before finally stepping into his destiny as a leader in Egypt. His journey took years, but every step was part of God's preparation. Delays are not denials. They are often periods of growth, refinement, and strengthening. Those who trust God through the waiting process will eventually see his promises come to pass. One of the key aspects of trusting God in transition is choosing faith over fear. Fear will always try to convince people that they are making a mistake, that they will fail, or that they should not take the risk. But faith silences fear by focusing on God's character rather than the circumstances. He is faithful, he is good, and he never leads his people into something without equipping them for it. The enemy uses fear to create doubt, but God provides his word as a source of truth and encouragement. Meditating on his promises and remembering his past faithfulness helps to build confidence during uncertain times. Another important part of transition is embracing the lessons that come with it. Every change, whether welcomed or unexpected, carries opportunities for growth. Sometimes God allows a transition to develop character, teach perseverance, or prepare for something greater. Instead of viewing transition as a disruption, it can be seen as a divine setup for something better. Those who embrace the lessons will come out stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the next season of life. Trusting God in transition is ultimately about believing that he knows what is best. It is about letting go of fear, embracing the unknown, and walking in faith. No matter how uncertain the future seems, God is already there. He has prepared the way, and he will provide the strength, wisdom, and resources needed to move forward. Those who trust him fully will find that every transition leads to a greater purpose, a deeper faith, and an even stronger relationship with him. Obedience to God's direction is one of the most important aspects of faith. When God says it's time to exit a situation, relationship, job, or environment, obedience becomes the key to walking in his plan. Often, people struggle with obedience because they become attached to where they are, even if God is calling them elsewhere. However, delaying obedience can lead to unnecessary pain, missed opportunities, and even spiritual stagnation. The moment God makes it clear that it is time to move, trust and action must follow. One of the biggest reasons people hesitate in obedience is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, and fear of leaving comfort can all create doubt. This is a natural human reaction, but it is not how God wants his people to respond. In the Bible, when God called Jonah to go to Nineveh, Jonah initially resisted and went in the opposite direction. His disobedience led to a storm, being thrown into the sea, and spending 3 days inside a great fish. Only after surrendering to God's command did he fulfill his mission. This story illustrates a powerful truth. Delayed obedience can bring unnecessary struggles. God's plans are always for the best. And when he calls someone to exit, it is always for a greater purpose. Another challenge with obedience is comfort. People naturally seek stability, but God often calls them out of their comfort zones to grow their faith. Abraham had to leave his homeland without knowing his final destination. Moses had to lead the Israelites out of Egypt despite their complaints. The disciples had to leave everything behind to follow Jesus. Each of these examples shows that obedience to God requires sacrifice. Holding on to comfort at the expense of obedience can prevent someone from stepping into God's best. Many times what feels secure now is actually limiting what God wants to do in the future. Obedience also requires faith. When God says it is time to exit, He does not always provide all the details up front. He may not reveal the next step until the first step is taken. This is because obedience is an act of trust. When Peter saw Jesus walking on water, he asked if he could come. Jesus told him to step out of the boat, but Peter had to actually step onto the water before experiencing the miracle. The same principle applies to any situation where God calls for an exit. If someone waits until everything makes sense before obeying, they may never move at all. Faith requires action even when the outcome is uncertain. One of the dangers of ignoring God's direction is missing out on his blessings. Sometimes what looks good in the present is actually a barrier to something better. When God told Lot and his family to leave Sodom, he was saving them from destruction. But Lot's wife looked back, longing for what she was leaving behind, and she turned into a pillar of salt. This shows that partial obedience is not true obedience. If God is calling someone to exit, they must do so fully, without hesitation or regret. Looking back at what God is asking them to leave can keep them from moving forward into his promises. Another aspect of obedience is understanding that God's perspective is greater than human understanding. What may not make sense now will become clear later. Joseph went through betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, yet every step was leading him toward God's plan to position him as a leader in Egypt. If Joseph had resisted the process or tried to control his own path, he might never have fulfilled his destiny. Similarly, when God says to exit, it is because he sees the bigger picture. Trusting his wisdom over personal reasoning is key to walking in obedience. Obedience also brings spiritual growth. Every time someone follows God's direction, their faith is strengthened. It deepens their relationship with him and increases their ability to hear his voice. People who consistently obey God develop a habit of trust, which makes future decisions easier. The more someone follows God's leading, the more confident they become in his guidance. On the other hand, ignoring his direction can lead to confusion, frustration, and distance from him. A life of obedience is a life of alignment with God's will, and that is where true peace is found. Obedience does not always make sense to others. Sometimes, when God calls someone to exit, those around them may not understand. Family, friends, or colleagues might question the decision. This is where faith must override the opinions of people. Noah obeyed God and built an ark. Even when others thought he was foolish, his obedience saved his family and preserved the future of humanity. When God speaks, the approval of others is not required. What matters is faithfulness to his call, even if it goes against common logic or societal expectations. Obedience is also connected to God's provision. When he calls someone to leave something behind, he has already prepared what is next. The Israelites were afraid to leave Egypt, but God had a land of abundance waiting for them. The disciples left their professions, but Jesus provided for all their needs. Elijah was led to a widow's house, and God miraculously provided food for them during a famine. God never asks someone to exit without preparing what is ahead. Trusting in his provision removes fear and allows for bold obedience. The final aspect of obedience is that it leads to fulfillment. When someone follows God's direction, they step into their true purpose. Many people live unfulfilled lives because they refuse to move when God says it is time. Staying in the wrong place, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, can lead to frustration and stagnation. But when someone obeys God's leading, they experience the joy and purpose that comes with being in his will. Walking in obedience leads to a life of impact, where every step aligns with his divine plan. In conclusion, when God says it's time to exit, it is not a suggestion. It is a divine direction meant for growth, protection, and purpose. Delayed obedience can bring unnecessary struggles, and holding on to comfort can prevent greater blessings. Faith is required to step into the unknown, trusting that God's plan is always better than what is left behind. Ignoring his voice can lead to missed opportunities, but obedience opens doors to spiritual growth, provision, and fulfillment. Even when others do not understand, God's wisdom must take priority over human reasoning. The journey of faith is not about knowing every step, but about trusting the one who leads. May you have the courage to walk in obedience, the faith to trust in God's plan, and the wisdom to know that every exit he commands is a step towards something greater. Good luck on your journey, and may you always find peace in his will. Thank you, and God bless.